Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Seb Butt, Head of Sales for Craft, a supplier resilience platform. And I'm joined today by Kamil. Kamil, if you want to give an intro for yourself.
Thanks, Seb. And yes, my name is Kamil Mizgier. I'm the Head of Risk Management Office at the University of Zurich. Risk management, you are probably all aware, is very established in the private industry. However, universities are catching up, and this is a historical moment that I've taken over this role for the first time, created at the University of Zurich. I'm basically responsible for implementing the supply chain and general risk management program at the university, which strictly follows industry best practice, including the 3 lines of defense and the way it is set up with the risk ownership and action owners that need to manage those risks. And maybe before I go into the details, I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the main risks of a university? Any idea? Excuse me? IP management. IP, yes. Knowledge, security. Any other? Protests, of course. So operational risks, I would say. Yes, that's a big thing for the university. One thing that people don't always think about is that universities have pretty large budgets. And for University of Zurich, which is the largest full university in Switzerland, this budget is around 1.5 billion Swiss francs yearly, coming from public and private sources. And obviously it needs to be managed in a professional way. So what also risk management does is really looking at those risks in the financial space. But procurement is obviously one big topic as well. So this presentation comes at a time where I've also published a paper that is based on the journey I had with risk management in various functions across both financial services industry, chemical industry, and now the academic setting. So you can scan this QR code if you'd like to download the paper, or visit my webpage and send me an email so that I can send it to you for free. The paper is really about digital transformation of various processes in procurement, but I take the supply chain risk perspective, as this is also where I did my PhD and research after graduating from ETH, which is just across the street in Zurich. I heard a few times Albert Einstein being mentioned in this conference. He actually got his PhD from University of Zurich as well. So obviously we have quite a big legacy, and risk management has been there for many, many years. Now it's becoming more and more professional. So coming to the paper, it's published in a journal that is under the Henry Stewart Publications Business and Management Collection. It's really towards C-suite executives. It's a practice paper and basically describes all the learnings that I've witnessed by doing risk management in practice and applying some theoretical lenses as well. For instance, something new that probably not everyone was thinking about in the past is the application of economic capital to supplier risk management. And that's the topic I've been working for many years. Requires a lot of data, data analytics, maybe even some AI, but you can find more about this in this paper. So,
Brilliant. Thanks, Kamil. I mean, maybe before we jump ahead, one question I guess I have for you is, you had a background of working in chemicals and financial services, and now in academia. What are the differences, or what are the similarities?
Exactly. So first, I would say similarity is that all these companies are complex organizations with international footprint and requirements towards governance. If you think about the chemical industry, I'd say it's very similar in the way that it's organized. However, the decisions take much less time to implement in the private industry as you compare this to a university. And University of Zurich has 500 years of history. That means it takes time to process everything that happened before and what leads to the next decision, which requires very different approach also in terms of how you assign ownership to processes. It's more than 500 professors who are experts in their domains, and still they own several risk types, for instance. So it's a very different, I would say, pace than you see in the private industry, where the command chain is clearly defined, I would say. Really at the center of my academic and industry experience has always been the risk management perspective. In a way, how can we move from being reactive to proactive? And I think there are three main elements for success. And whether it's the private industry or a university or any public institution, before you think about, let's say, supplier risk in that domain, you need to first get the buy-in of all your senior leadership across functions. And this really starts with defining who are your strategic customers, what are the products or services you are delivering, what are the critical items that you need to create those products, and only then you can really start thinking about building a supplier risk program which is proactive. So the second ingredient, obviously, if you know what you want to do, you need to have visibility in your supply chain, and that's where technology support is inevitable right now. For a company like Dow with 40,000 and more suppliers, if you want to have quick decisions, you need to really be able to identify your critical suppliers basically immediately. And last but not least, it's the data-driven supplier relationship management. I think if you want to be proactive about risk management, you actually have to manage your supplier relationships in a proactive way. Having clearly defined roles and responsibilities, having segmentation put in place so that you really know who to talk to when things go wrong. And there is something like a strategic sourcing process, probably everyone is familiar with. At my previous company, we had very clearly defined steps how to manage suppliers throughout their lifetime. And basically, it starts with supplier qualification, the RFP, where, in my opinion, again, if you want to be proactive, you need to include a risk score already at that stage, before you even start doing business with this supplier. In the next stage, during the onboarding, you have risk assessments. Again, you need to have different risk types being assessed by using technology. If you think about all these numbers of suppliers, supplier risk management, including early warnings and proactive risk monitoring, and then we go into supplier relationship management. So that's where you really do all the magic with segmentation that is risk-based, with performance management, where key risk indicators are used to drive your decisions, and finally, an informed risk-based decision whether you continue, you develop your suppliers, or if you want to phase out, should be supported by data and less by expert judgment.
Fantastic. I mean, one question I have perhaps for you, Kamil, is prioritization. We often hear about, how do we focus on the suppliers that we need to be worried about? Do we look at all of our suppliers? Do we look at a subset of the suppliers? You mentioned prioritization earlier. Could you share a bit more?
Yes, so prioritization in that case, it really boils down to finding out the business case you want to support. So sometimes it will be your strategic supplier, that is the first one that you kind of continue the discussion. In the other very different use cases we've seen, it's the spend tail. Some suppliers that we didn't think about are actually making the biggest impact on our profitability. So it really starts by defining the business case together with your sales team, and then propagating the decision making to the first stage where you really select your suppliers.
Yeah. We've also often heard that treating every supplier in the same way is perhaps not going to be the wisest way of doing something like this, because ultimately you also have to think about your budgets in terms of spend to risk management. So treating all suppliers in the same way perhaps is not the most prudent way to approach it. Maybe your top 10 or 20% or 30% of your suppliers is where you want to go very, very deep, and then you've got just your remainders. Okay, thank you so much, Kamil. We've embraced many of the principles of the framework that Kamil just outlined here into craft. And so for those of you who do not know who Craft is, we're a SaaS solution formed 8 years ago in the UK, now based out of the US. Some of our customers include folks like the US Department of Defense. We work with some large manufacturers like Caterpillar, some banks and various other industries as well. And so through the Craft platform, we've kind of segmented kind of our approach, and these are all kind of workflows that you're able to execute, but it all begins with evaluating your suppliers. You want to make sure that the suppliers that you're working with, you're able to understand what are they about. Are they healthy from a financial perspective? Are they doing things correctly from an ESG perspective? Are they diverse owned? Multiple different ways of looking at the suppliers. And so we're providing you data that we've curated ourselves or data that we've absorbed from many of our partners. But I do want to add that we do still maintain a human in the loop process to make sure that the accuracy of the data is high. I know we've had a lot about AI at this conference and probably many other conferences as well, but we've maintained that for the moment, it's still very noisy out there, and we want to make sure that the data is accurate, and therefore we've invested in a team of people who do check information. Now, once you've kind of understood the data, you've sensed the signals, you've understood perhaps everything that you need to understand, you want to monitor them in an ongoing way. It's not a snapshot in time. I think due diligence for suppliers in the past, done at the point of onboarding, was great, but then things can change days, weeks, hours, months later. So ongoing monitoring is something that Craft supports through the tool. You're able to continuously receive alerts, you're able to continuously be made aware of any situations that you should be concerned with. We then move to the assess part of the platform. The assess part of the platform is designed in a way that you're seeing risk from your perspective and not some other company's perspective. So you will add your own kind of weights and thresholds, whatever concerns you most. And so the ultimate scores that you receive and you understand about your suppliers is from your perspective and not someone else's. Now, when you've identified the risks, you need to do something about it. And so through the respond part of the platform, you're able to kick off a workflow, you're able to design things that are going to be, again, in line with your business practices to respond to whatever that may be. Is the response going to be to replace them? Is the response going to be to work with them to perhaps develop some of their programs? And then finally, we want to avoid this in the future. And so through Craft, you're able to optimize yourself and your supplier relationship for the future to make sure risks like those are therefore avoided. A little bit about Craft. Kamil and I first met when Kamil was at Dow, obviously was at Craft, and we engaged on a project. And perhaps Kamil, if you're going to begin with maybe introducing some of the reasons why, in this particular case, we decided to partner together.
Yes, and that's exactly the case. I was leading a global supplier relationship and risk management program at Dow. Between 2020 and 2023. So I had the chance to go through two major events. One was a pandemic and the other the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war. And basically these two events showed that supplier visibility is key. As you probably also know, you have to very quickly identify your single sources, not only in the first tier, but also in the second and third. When it started with the energy crisis, obviously the inflation and costs blew up. We also needed to know where we have dependencies with suppliers that are affected by the higher prices. And again, here, first tier is not enough. We needed to really focus on those further tiers. And that was also aligned with my previous research, where I basically also developed some methods how to identify bottlenecks in supply chains by using simulation and data. At that time, I didn't have this data, so when we met with Craft, I was really surprised how the technology has changed over the years, and we could really see what's happening in the first and second and third tier. So that's the main, I would say, introduction into this use case.
Absolutely, and then perhaps to add a couple more reasons why we did engage at that point. So, a lack of market visibility. I spoke earlier about getting information or fresh information about your suppliers in an ongoing way. Well, getting things like commodity fluctuations, particularly in industry such as chemicals, was very, very critical to the business. We also identified through the process that to some extent, some of this was already happening, but it was happening manually. And it took hundreds of hours, as we learned from our friends at Dow. So our objective was to reduce that from hundreds of hours down to minutes or a very short amount of time if possible. And then finally, there had been examples where plants had shut down. Ultimately, what we all trying to do here is to ensure supply continues. And in order to do that, we need to make sure goods and services that you have been committed to be provided, they do arrive on time. And when that doesn't happen, the worst case scenario is clearly plants can close down, factories can close down, things come to an end. And that's when supply risk management becomes really, really interesting to absolutely everyone in that organization, from the C-suite down. We want to try and get ahead of that. So we committed to a program working with Dow. As Kamil said, first objective here was to kind of determine the end tier or the multi-tier supply chain. This is just a quick visual from our tool itself, where you can identify very quickly through the technology who are our suppliers. It's a process. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, but ultimately this is kind of how you get to visualize it. Taking one example of a value chain that we ended up mapping together, we looked at 61 tier 1 suppliers. Now, that process of determining 61 took quite some time, because the initial idea was, well, let's go broad and let's try and look at all of our tier 1 suppliers and see what we can understand. However, taking that approach would probably cause a huge amount of headache for Kamil and his colleagues, because that would probably mean many, many, many thousands of suppliers. And so our advice and kind of how we coach those we work with is to focus on the value chains, which are most important, which are most critical. And in this case, we identified 61. As you can see, when 61 tier 1 companies were mapped to tier 2, we had identified 1,000 sub-tier suppliers at the second tier. And then when we went one step further, again, there's now 26,000 suppliers. So still, even with a very small number of tier 1 suppliers, there's a huge number of companies to now monitor and understand the risks associated with them.
Yeah, and maybe just to add a little bit of color, it's really probably the most important decision how you identify those 61 or 20 or whatever first wave of suppliers that you want to run the process with. Because as you see, you end up with huge numbers of suppliers, and it's actually the process of identification of these suppliers is not a random process. It really takes time to already get a good idea of where problems can lie. So it's not a fully automated process that somehow magically reveals the problems in the further tiers. You need to have really good understanding of the business impact and everything that's going on already in the supplier chain, so that the tool in the end gives you really this additional value in terms of understanding where problems lie and much higher precision. But the process itself really started with a sales team telling us what are the critical products, who are our critical customers, and that's how we then ended up with this 61.
Absolutely. And then some of the outcomes that we were obviously able to understand, mapping, as we've already mentioned, being able to evaluate those suppliers against a variety of different risk assessments to ensure that we understood the health of not only your tier 1 suppliers, but also the suppliers further down in the tiers, and then also identifying or flagging from a range of different risk categories that were important to you. And I think, Kamil, you shared with us, obviously at the time, geopolitical issues were of high importance, attributing back to maybe some suppliers that were high dependency suppliers was obviously massively important. And with the background of some of the events going on at the time, that was also something that was critical. But we were able to execute an analysis and provide you that data back. But I just wanted to share that quick example around how we have ultimately partnered in this situation with Dow. So key takeaways from us: understand your priority problems. We have focus on areas that you really do need to focus on. Risk management and supply risk management is a very broad discipline. I'm sure you've met other vendors or heard from other vendors as well. But be very specific before you scale. Understand exactly what you can get out of a process like this. Second, evaluate your resilience, maturity, and capacity. Not every organization is ready to kind of go into the tiers and do everything that we've done. Perhaps in this case, maybe just getting your immediate house in order, looking at your tier 1 suppliers is perhaps the place to start. And then ultimately developing that supply risk management program. Having that standard operating process where it doesn't exist in the companies that we work with. The technology does not get adopted. The technology is very, very slow to be used, and the uptake is very, very poor. So before you begin and you purchase a piece of technology, our advice is always to build that standard operating practice first, or partner with the organization you're working with in order to build it out.
Maybe also having this buy-in and support of senior leadership from the beginning is really one thing that can make or break this program. So definitely something to consider up front as the most important task.
Thanks for using Slido. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Feel free to send some more in. We've got about 4 minutes left. Right, so let's just start off with the first one that came in. How does Craft anticipate and detect supply risks? What factors are considered when doing the risk prediction / anticipation?
Primarily, it's about being very, very broad in the risks that we're looking at. So we're looking at a very large number of sources. Some of the data we curate ourselves. Some of the data we ingest from 70 different data partners who are specialists in their own right. Some of those will be household names to folks like yourself. So EcoVadis is one of our partners, or CSR Hub, or Security Scorecard. So bringing in the historical data, however, not just the point in time, we also look at historical data. And through a combination of those two things, we're able to help you anticipate where those risks are going to be coming from in the future. So that's kind of maybe the data-driven approach. Alongside that, you've also got the mapping and the end-tier mapping. And a lot of folks will ask us, well, what's the reason for end-tier mapping? And to be honest with you, there's a couple of different answers. There could be a regulatory reason for doing mapping. However, if you are looking at it from a supply chain perspective to optimize your supply chains, if you know about factors or problems affecting your tier 3 or tier 4 suppliers early enough, you can start to predict and build models to let you know that that might be something that's going to be a problem for you in a few weeks or a few months' time.
Excellent. All right, we've got one about the tier system. So once tier 1 suppliers are identified, how are you able to identify tier 2 and 3 suppliers?
Yeah, great question. So this is a fast developing area of technology. Underpinning what we do at Craft is looking at bills of lading documentation and shipping manifests, shipping trade data. There are some natural restrictions, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But being able to bring that trade data in and creating a model helps us to identify who are those tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers or tier 4. And some customers want to go even further, but obviously those problems that we talked about earlier do manifest. Now, that's not on its own is not enough. Of course, one obvious thing is if a company is not shipping things from one country to another, how do you learn about those? And so we augment the data. We augment it through looking at things such as mobile phone data, which is available through organizations like Navistar. We look at logo recognition. So if on websites you've got customers listed or partners listed, we'll try and infer from there as well. And then general website aggregation. And really it's a combination of all of those that will start to get you perhaps 40 or 50 or 60% coverage of your multi-tier supply chain. That doesn't get the whole thing done. Ultimately, trade secrets or information known by the category managers, that should also feed into the map. So we'll work very, very collaboratively with our customers to bring in data or information that you already have. And then finally, if you have to, and no one wants to do this, but ultimately you may have to resort to surveys right at the end. But do all of that first to see where you can land, and then perhaps complete the circle with some surveys.
Great. And then kind of a tangent off of that, someone's asking, what's the accuracy of the tier 2 plus mapping?
Yeah, great question, and something that we obviously get asked all the time. So no false positives in the data that we identify. Of course, we are, in general, identifying relationships. And so the information is letting us know that there's a business relationship. It's sometimes, however, difficult to determine exactly the nature of that relationship. So there are some natural limitations here. What we say is this is an ongoing process. We will start somewhere, and we will continue to refine that model over time. It's not going to stop after that kind of first wave.
Absolutely. All right, any final words?
Yeah, please have a look at the papers for sure. That's something I would encourage anyone to look at. I have also my column in the European Business Review, so from time to time I'll publish something there.
Fantastic.
And yeah, I think the supply chain and tier mapping, procurement, whatever technology does in order to support business decisions is the way to go. So I'm really a fan of the work that also Seb and his team are doing.
Thank you so much. And I will add, we've looked at the paper and we've looked at the research. And if you haven't started this journey, I would recommend reading this paper and others that Kamil's written and other literature out there. If you don't have that standard operating practice, look at some of the frameworks that others have built and it'll help you develop yours. Thank you all for joining us today.
All right, thanks to Kamil and Seb.